Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. We are very happy to welcome you back to day 2 of the 2021 8th Annual HITLAB Summit here in New York City. We are thrilled to have people from around the world attending today. And today is day 2 of HITLAB's biggest meeting of the year, presenting evidence and tools and techniques and new technologies and terminologies around what people are using in digital health and how they're using it. And yesterday's sessions, both in the US and in India, again, just to remind everyone, this is a 24-hour, 3-day extravaganza with hundreds of speakers presenting on topics that are wide-ranging and extraordinarily comprehensive around digital health and its adoption, the technologies that are being adopted in the countries all over the world and programs all over the world. Yesterday's program across both India and the US featured a lot of the topics that we were looking at. We've started off with a tribute to Glenn DeVries and really did dive into the major programs that we're seeing in digital health, whether it's working with major health plans like Kaiser and CVS Aetna, and certainly the folks at Anthem and others, or whether it's the major life science companies and what they're doing in response to not only virtualizing a lot of their clinical trials and a lot of their decentralized trials, but also managing through some of the supply chain issues and managing through a lot of the delivery and being able to ensure that medicines and that various vaccines are available to people around the world. We talked a lot about yesterday the different methodological approaches that people are taking to studying their technologies and how they're utilizing their digital therapeutics and testing them in ways that will gain expedited use authorizations with the FDA. And throughout the day, we had amazing sessions on the diversity and inclusion in healthcare, social determinants of health, and how major players in the healthcare system, such as New York City's Economic Development Corporation, are working tirelessly to improve health equity, not just locally here in the New York metropolitan area and New York City, but also globally. And we'll hear more about that today. Today's sessions, again, are very focused on the range of digital health solutions, whether it's an app or a voice skill, or whether it's a genetic tool, or whether it's a telemedicine remote patient monitoring technology, or other technologies in the bioinformatics area. And so we'll be discussing those, and we'll be, again, chatting with folks. You'll meet many new people. So please use the chat rooms, please use the networking centers. And by all means, if you have any questions, contact anyone from the HITLAB team. We encourage you to really do whatever you can to be a part of the community and lend in this leading effort in promoting the optimal diffusion of digital health across the global healthcare ecosystem. And talking about the global healthcare ecosystem, we're honored today to have as our keynote speaker the CEO of the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund, Bill Taranto, who is going to talk about what he's seeing as some of the developing trends on the horizon to look out for as he's looking to build upon just the extraordinary success that we've seen from the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund over the last decade, predominantly referring to Livongo and the scale up and IPO and eventual exit there, and then obviously Preventus just earlier this year as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Bill Taranto. Bill.
Thank you, Stan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody participating today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. As Stan said, I'm Bill Taranto. I'm president of the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund, and we're Merck's corporate venture arm that's focused 100% to digital health. We're probably one of the largest digital health investors in the world. What I want to talk to you today about are some digital health trends to watch in 2022, but it's really more about predictions of where I think digital health is going to grow, and really where the GHI fund is looking to deploy capital as we go forward. Now, I'll preface to saying these sort of trends and as well as our predictions or where digital health is going is all rooted within the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund strategy. If you've heard me speak before, we have two fundamental tenets to our investment thesis. One is that we believe data is the currency we're going to use to transact in the future healthcare market. So when you see the trends, the underlying sort of focus or trend or companies that we're investing in or companies that are going to grow, all are data companies actually in the end. The second component to it is that all these trends actually are tied together. Because of the data component, you'll see that each trend might lead into the next trend. And the way we think about investing is to mix and match these trends together and try to build an ecosystem that's fully integrated to the healthcare market. And I think the third piece, is that the way we think about healthcare, the way we do our strategy, we actually predicted much of these trends way in advance. And you'll see as I go through them, I'll give you a couple of examples of investments that we made well in advance of where these trends occurred. So I think that's kind of a neat thing that we were able to predict this a little in advance. But what do I see in 2022? So let me begin. I have to do always a forward-looking statement by law because these are just the GHI funds look at the future. Okay, the first trend that I want to talk to you today about is that telemedicine is going to move into chronic care. We saw a big increase in telemedicine during the COVID era last year, and it was a 38% times increase in virtual visits, but that's in acute care only. What we're starting to see is really heavy movement into chronic care. And of course, as Stan mentioned, Livongo, which we were an investor in, was one of the first big companies to move into chronic care and diabetes. But we're seeing movement now into cardiology and all other sorts of chronic diseases. And I think this is a really interesting area of where medicine's going to go. As we see the consumer getting more engaged, they're more interested in moving into ways in which they don't have to go into a brick and mortar setting, and they can get it anywhere, anytime, any place, whether you live in a rural area, you live in a city area, or wherever you live, you can have access to care. And that's one of the big things that telemedicine does, is it provides access to care. But there are other players within this market, beyond Livongo. We certainly have American Well, and then now Teladoc, which acquired Livongo, is probably the largest player that's providing telemedicine solutions to the market. So we think this area is probably going to be one of the fastest moving areas that we see in 2022. But again, it's around chronic care, not around acute care. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that if we think about where the money is actually spent, 85% of it's spent on chronic care. So it's important for telemedicine and the telemedicine providers to move beyond the acute care market and actually move into this chronic care market. So my second prediction is that digital therapeutics are finally here. We're seeing probably we're actually seeing a tremendous amount of money being put from investors into digital DTX companies. And we've seen actually an increase of 79% in 2020 into those type of companies. What I think is interesting from a pharma perspective, just generally speaking, is that we're taking a very thoughtful approach to this market. We do see value in it. I think the pharma industry, though, would probably like to see a lot of clinical validation. That's obviously where HITLAB comes into play, because they can do a clinical validation of your DTX. Much like we do the traditional therapeutic, where we're looking for a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial to help us understand the clinical value of these DTXs. But what we're really seeing is in 2026, the spending on DTX is projected to be over $13 billion. Now, interesting enough, we were one of the first investors in a DTX application. We were an early investor in WellDoc. Which actually over time has now become a really prominent company in the DTX market. But we're seeing a tremendous growth across a lot of areas. The biggest growth area right now is in mental health, because it seems to work extremely well in all different types of mental health diseases and helping patients manage those types of diseases. But again, there are some other companies within this space. We see Pear Therapeutics, we see Quick Therapeutics as well. So there are other companies that are advancing within this space, but I can tell you what I've seen in the past year, and a lot of the work that I've done with Health Excel is that there's just a tremendous number of companies launching within the DTX space. So I think this is a great area for investment for GHI as we move forward in 2022. The next area that I want to talk about is the social determinants of health is becoming a top priority. And this is across all organizations. This is not just investors. This is around payers, providers, and the entire healthcare network. We're actually seeing a tremendous amount of states making SDOH mandates tracking. And this is really about access. Because what we're finding is that as you go into both poor communities, rural communities, or any kind of community you go into, that there's a large number of patients that don't get any type of access, and whether it's based on their race, their sexual orientation, their poverty levels, whatever the reasons are, they're not getting access, and it's important to get patients access, and that's why this has become such a top priority across the industry. We recently did a investment in a company called Unite Us, which is really working closely with the entire industry around trying to find those patients and getting those patients access to care. What we find is that 80% of health outcomes are actually attributed to SDOH issues. That just tells you that this is probably one of the biggest areas of health that we need to invest in as a community. Now, what's interesting is telemedicine, as I mentioned earlier, is actually one of the ways to reach these types of patients, because again, telemedicine can reach any type of community. So the whole idea is, as we understand what these patients need, is maybe they just need to be driven to their appointment, or they need access to that technology that allows them to have their appointment. The whole idea is delivering better healthcare across the entire community. So we're actually looking to do more investments within this particular space, but there are some other companies that are starting to move into this space. And I see probably a little more funding going into this space across the venture capital community. The next space is one that I've always invested in, and I still think is growing, is the remote monitoring of everything. 3 in 5 adults are chronically ill, and we can monitor just about anything today. When I first invested in monitoring 10 years ago, it's sort of like where AI is today, or even digital therapeutics, where it was very early back then. But today, the devices that can monitor patients are so small, so effective, and they collect so much data, and it's faster, and it's much more reliable clinical data, that monitoring is really at the forefront of activity today. And we're actually seeing that, especially around readmissions, that it's a massive amount of penalties that got paid in 2020. And especially in cardiac care, something as simple as remote monitoring, can prevent that readmission from happening. And I think what's even more fascinating is we're starting to see that monitoring is moving into areas that we've never seen it move into before. Areas like oncology, which is really important. It's always traditionally been in areas like cardiology, where Stan had mentioned earlier that we had a company called Preventus that we recently sold to Boston Scientific that measured AFib and really helped define when a patient was going to be having a stroke. So again, the great thing about this particular area is that you can monitor anything today. Almost any condition can be monitored, and it can be monitored remotely. And again, now when you think about what we mentioned before about SDOH and the concerns of those patients who are usually chronically ill, we can actually monitor them from a remote location. We can use telemedicine to provide better care. And of course, if we can add a DTX to that type of patient, we're now getting a full integrated solution to help manage the entire healthcare population. So again, you can start to see how these sort of investments all tie together, and these predictions begin to tie together where we think healthcare is going. But this is probably one of my favorite areas to invest in. We're going to continue to look for areas of investment, especially in oncology, now that Merck's, in the past few years has moved heavily into oncology with Keynote. So the next one is that real world data comes more into focus. We're starting to see that it's a massive impacts, annually on RWE can have on a pharma company specific, but any kind of healthcare. And that's that clinical validation of where real world data is coming into focus. And what we're seeing is that AI is really driving a lot of this real world data impact. We're probably moving closer into personalized medicine than we ever moved into before. We have a couple companies in this space, Ciox, including one of them that was just recently acquired by Datavant. But what we're really seeing is that It's a a massive valuation difference between similar RDB companies as this market is evolving. This is probably one of the largest markets for valuation that we've seen. And what we're seeing where a lot of this data is coming from is in the clinical development side of the world. We're seeing a lot of AI companies that are focusing on sort of the whole right patient, right place, right time concept within clinical development, and then the use of RWE and RWD to help better patient stratification, patient identification. How do we actually better move to personalized medicine? This also requires a lot of investment in HIT infrastructure. This is all the whole idea about data security, privacy, and storage, data aggregation, integration, and harmonization, and of course, the top layer, data analytics and informatics. That's what drives all of this space. But what we begin to see is that this whole RWD space, which is driven by that infrastructure space, is still probably the largest space for valuation and growth within the healthcare market. And again, we're going to continue to invest in this place. But again, you can then see the linkage to the other areas as we begin to drive data from monitoring or from SDOH or DTX. That data becomes extremely important and becomes part of RWE that allows us to make better outcomes and better decisions around our patients and community. So again, all these things tie together, and we do believe that RWE is going to be one of the bigger areas of investment. The other areas that I think is growing is this patient-centered models are finally starting to get traction. We're seeing over $750 billion of employer spending on healthcare, but 30% of that healthcare is kind of spend that is wasted. So how do we get the actual patient to be better involved in their healthcare? One of the areas that we've invested is a company called Transcarent, which is a company that's trying to help the patient make better decisions around what type of treatment they should get, what doctor they should go to, and what is the best cost for that treatment. And then how do they take control of that versus being dictated to where they should get their treatment, how they should spend their money, and what is the eventual outcome that they should expect. But this space is probably, I think, is going to be the next biggest growing area. Is how do you get the patient more involved in their own care? And it's not just about things like DTX or apps that help patients, manage their care. That's a piece of it, but it's really about ownership of healthcare and really getting patients to take control of where they've use their healthcare, how they spend their healthcare dollars, and how they interact with the healthcare community, with not only the patient but with the provider as well as the payer market. So we see this as a massively growing market again, and we're looking to try to invest more within this space as well. And again, this ties to all the other types of trends that we're seeing within the healthcare market. Finally, I'll just tell you a little bit about our group and what we do. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really based on this theory of two investment principles. One is that data is the currency we're using in the healthcare market. And the second is that we don't believe point solutions work in the healthcare market, that you have to work in an integrated healthcare market, and you have to tie and mix companies together. And if you look at all our trends that I just mentioned, they all fit these categories. The therapy planning is the whole front end of care, where we're talking about better patient identification and patient stratification. And that's where AI tools and RWE and those types of modalities exist, and where we're really trying to move into that personalized medicine. The care management space, that's that whole area of understanding how do we better manage the patient's journey. That could be care coordination, but that's where things like monitoring come into play, DTX, social determinants of health. How do we really understand how the patient is managing their journey? As I mentioned, that whole infrastructure space around AI, analytics, the whole idea of aggregation, integration, and harmonization of data, and where does that all fit in the management of the patient and trying to understand that data to move to better outcomes. But the whole idea for us is to invest across this continuum and then link all these companies together. But again, it's all really harnessed under the idea that all these companies need to be data companies. And then the question just becomes is how do we take that data, curate it in a fashion that drives outcomes and clinical validation, and we really deliver better healthcare to the patient. And then finally, this is just our portfolio, but you can see that we're really investing in the spaces that I've mentioned. We have a host of companies within that therapy planning section, the care management, that enabling tech. We look at the future of healthcare in our next horizon bucket, where we're looking 5 years out of applications that we believe have impact in healthcare. We just don't know how yet or where, and that could be things like quantum computing or biome development, just areas that we think will impact healthcare as we go forward. We're just not quite sure yet how it's going to impact, but we're looking at that. But we're really trying to cover every area of digital health that we can think of across the patient continuum and healthcare continuum, and then trying to deliver that to the community. With that, I'll stop there because I know Stan had some questions for me, or maybe from the audience. So I'll stop sharing and bring Stan back in. And
That's great. Hey,
the
Bill.
last 10 minutes.
It's fantastic. And again, for the audience, you've got, hopefully, you know how to use Zoom and you know how to use the chat function and the Q&A function. If you have questions, or within the actual HITLAB conference platform, go ahead and lock the questions in there as well. But, I think, Bill, from the perspective of the audience, and again, I'm just looking through the attendees, and again, it's all over the world. It's people from all different sectors, from health plans to digital health startups to see a couple of employers, and then obviously life sciences and hospitals and physicians. I think the big question right now is, when you look at what's happening and you look at the ecosystem and how it's evolving with this new endemic virtual first framework that we're moving into, and you've seen the major health plans all now move into virtual first. I was in South Carolina for Thanksgiving, and I was seeing virtual first billboards there, where people talking about virtual visits. How do you see the ecosystem, and what are the big technologies that are going to benefit from your perspective in a virtual first healthcare system in the U.S.?
Well, I certainly think the technologies that support telemedicine, as we mentioned, I think that's big. But you also have to understand that technology in healthcare isn't there to take over all of healthcare. People still want to go to the brick and mortar setting. There are still conditions that require patients to go into the brick and mortar setting. But I do think, and as part of the trends that I mentioned, I think like DTX is going to change the way we think about medicine. Can we deliver medicine differently than we do instead of the traditional therapeutic? You couple that with things like telemedicine, and then the ability to gather that data and turn that data into something of value that we are showing outcomes. I think when you look at those kind of three areas combined together, that's the sort of enabling technologies that I think are going to drive that future healthcare market. It'll never be 100% virtual, because at least not in the near term, because it just doesn't quite work that way. Certainly patients that suffer from cancer diseases still need to go in for chemotherapy and those type of treatments. So there's always going to be some type of interaction live inside of a brick and mortar situation. But these technologies are all enabling technologies that better healthcare. And I think it's all around access. So anything that provides access to healthcare as a technology, I think, is extremely important, and delivering healthcare at a better cost is what I think these technologies will do as we push forward into this virtual setting.
Absolutely, I totally agreed there. And great question coming in from Fran, and I think it's a question we hear all the time at Columbia Business School and certainly at the lab. Which is around reimbursement. What trends are you seeing with different states and different regions of the country around not only telemedicine parity, but also telemedicine reimbursement? And what are you seeing there?
Yeah, the interesting thing is reimbursement for things like telemedicine and monitoring, and even DTX aren't quite at the levels of traditional, seeing of a patient and physician interaction. I can talk a little bit about the monitoring market, because we've been in that space so much. That space has still struggled with reimbursement, especially around CMS reimbursement, and what's the appropriate type of reimbursement for those types of monitoring activities, and are you actually providing some kind of outcome that's differential to an in-person visit? And I think that's where a lot of these types of reimbursement issues lie. A lot of it is it's still new to the FDA. It's still new to the reimbursement organizations. DTX is brand new. Monitoring is still in its infancy, even though it's 10 years old. And so I think the struggle is, how do these modalities and technologies truly advance healthcare in a clinical way that is either equivalent or better than what the type of treatment they were getting before. And I think it's just going to take time for reimbursement to catch up to traditional, ways of reimbursement. But it's on the radar of every plan. It's on the radar of CMS. I just think it's gathering more evidence over time of just how important these types of technologies are to delivering clinical care. But right now, I would just say the reimbursement market isn't equal to what it is to a traditional way of we've gone about treating ourselves and meeting with physicians in the healthcare community.
Brilliant. And again, Bill, thank you for your time today. As always, you're always contributing to the ecosystem, and certainly Columbia and the lab, and we greatly appreciate it. And please stay warm. I know it's cold over there in Pennsylvania, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So a warm round of applause for Bill Taranto again, from the HITLAB's research and standpoint, the head of the most successful digital health fund in the world, certainly over the last several years, but even before then. So if everyone could adjourn here, we're going to move over to see Meg Walsh, the global head for Amazon Web Services. Looking forward to seeing her talk, and looking forward to seeing you online in the networking rooms and chat rooms. Take care, everybody.